If you want to read better and think more clearly and understand the ideas shaping our world, then this might be for you. You should join the Dr. John Patrick Book Club. It's a private online community where we read great books together and learn how to think, not just what to think. Inside, you're going to have access to Dr. John Patrick as we work through books and ask questions. If you've ever felt like there are books you should be reading or ideas that you want to understand better, but you didn't want to do it alone, this is a good place to start. You can find the link in the show notes or the description below to join.
Good morning, everyone, or good morning for me. I don't know what time of day it will be when you're listening to this, but thank you for being there anyway. This last weekend, Craig organized a book reading for me, or at least an introduction to a book, and we chose The Abolition of Man. What I was concerned about, and what concerns me a lot, is that we don't read anymore, at least not seriously. We read trash fiction and we read screens, which last a few minutes. But really digging into a serious book is not something we do. And we were supposedly going to do that with The Abolition of Man, but as per usual, we didn't get that far. But it was clear that some important things had been achieved from the correspondence that followed. What Lewis is doing in The Abolition of Man, he starts with, in the first chapter, it's only 3 chapters and only 100 pages in the edition that I use. And you can actually now get it in a bigger format in, almost a book. It's a booklet. But I realize now why he got to me all those years ago, because I realized that the nature of education had changed in my lifetime, and it hadn't changed for the better. It had been, in fact, destroyed. And what Lewis is doing way back in the 1940s is recognizing that this process is underway. He knew that the Judeo-Christian thought was responsible for everything that we really valued in the area of intellectual activity. It's all built on that foundation, and it's soaked into the culture. Thus, as I've used as an illustration many times, and I'll go on doing so that you recognize that that's what was, and we need to bring it back by the way we talk and particularly the way we educate our children at the dining room table. But essentially, the 10 Commandments were known by all working people in the West over time. It was norm. I mean, reading didn't happen as a public activity until the time of the Reformation and the printing press. And initially, the book that was printed most was the Bible, by a country mile. There was no competitor. But it did mean that ordinary people, who were actually, many of them, deprived of what they could have done, now had a book to read that was accessible and serious. I mean, reading the Gospels, for people who've never read anything like it, is stunning. Especially Muslims, when they first read the Gospels, they all say the same thing. Oh, this is so different. I regularly now screen for Muslims who've got converted, describing the process, because a lot of conversions are happening in the Middle East, and invariably, or not quite invariably, frequently, it involves dreams, and it involves meeting a man in white, who they know is Jesus, who they know knows their names, and in some way, even on screens, they realize this is something entirely different, that they are loved. Girls in particular say, I felt for the first time in my life that I was seen. Christ could do that in a dream, even without a word being spoken. And it's so real that these young women, with a struggle, realize they have to be honest about where they've arrived, even though it could cost them their lives and will certainly cost them their family. And they say, It doesn't matter. This is what I need to do. So they're giving us in the Western world, where we've become so blasé about our cultural abilities, a reminder of where it came from. And a reminder of how we have lost our passion. And our culture is changing dramatically in the last 50 years. In North America, when the Bible was taken out of school in the 60s, that really made a change. The founders of North America were all Christian, of course, and they wanted everybody to inhabit the same story of meaning. And they wrote a constitution that assumed that people would accept that. And they made that constitution so difficult that without cooperation, it couldn't work. Because what they feared is what's happening to us now, that people from other cultures would come in and they would be able to usurp power because they could manipulate the situation. It's happening in Britain big time. Multiculturalism is a total disaster. And it was always apparent that it was a disaster. But the liberal elite still think it's a good idea. But cultures are made from what you hold in common, not from diversity. You don't make a team out of having everybody different. You make a team because you're all working to the same rules. And what Lewis could see happening was that the education process was being usurped by professionalizing it and accrediting it. He didn't say it in those terms, but he understood that the Faculty of Education does not believe in a Judeo-Christian culture as the foundation for everything else. But it is. And that's something you've got to learn to talk about. I mean, in his opening chapter, he has his two small L liberal teachers trying to get students to read better, but without being able to bring themselves in the culture they've been educated in themselves to realize you need a foundation. At the end of the day, when instructions are given in law or in regulations in organizations, there's always a question of authority that has to be dealt with. Says who? If everybody's opinion is equally valuable, then how do you rule? The Western world produced countries that bend the knee to a system of law, of rules. Now that law over time became very flexible in the sense that the real principles everybody knew, and that actually very related to the Ten Commandments and to the legal structure of Judaism, and taken over by Christianity. But now, no, they deny that without realizing what they have done. And Lewis, in The Abolition of Man, first shows that the divide between those who understood that wisdom, self-discipline, and virtue were derived from as he calls it, the Dao, spelt T-A-O. I don't think that's the most successful bit of the book. He could have just used more colloquial terms. But he wanted to show that in ancient cultures there was agreement. Now we don't have agreement. That's your opinion, they say. Now, in all the great cultures the world has seen, there's always been a huge swath of culture which determined what everybody agreed, and everybody agreed to it, and that's what formed the culture, warts and all. Now, if you go to the biggest culture of all, which was animistic paganism, not using that pejoratively in case anybody is allergic to the words I've used, that's merely descriptive. There, the most important thing is the clan. Authority nations don't exist in animistic paganism. The biggest thing that exists is a tribe. And within the tribe, there are clans and families And the big difference between them and, say, Christianity and Judaism is that loyalty to the clan or to the family is more important than truth about it. Whereas in the New Testament and in the Old, loyalty derives from commitment to certain truths. And those truths are predictable and reliable, and they make the society work. Now, in Africa, I've been very interested in it. There's a young, I say young, he's not that young. He must be probably in his late 40s, I don't know. But a Nigerian, an Igbo, I believe, yes, I think he said he was Igbo, it sounds as though he is, who got to America and is naturalized in America. But he's very concerned about Africa and why it's such a disaster in terms of government. And he's doing a very good job. His name is Frank Zano. He's worth looking at. He's particularly concerned about South Africa because in the 1990s, when the ANC took over, South Africa was a flourishing country. I first went there in 1987, and I've been there fairly regularly over subsequent years. And it has changed steadily, and not in a good way. Bit of life that I know best, of course, is the medical bit, and the public health system of South Africa in the pre-ANC years was very well run indeed, because the Afrikaners and to a lesser extent the English are always more concerned about themselves than anything else. They realized that you couldn't have everything for everybody straight away. The economy wasn't big enough. So what they wanted first, and they did it very well, was basic public health and early childhood care to see that immunizations happened, that there were people trained to deal with things like gastroenteritis. The system for treating gastroenteritis in Witwatersrand, when I first went there, was so efficient. It was incredible. That's all disappeared. It's fallen apart. One guy who I knew quite well, who was running a very efficient system, he was so broken-hearted he emigrated. Because it was immediately divided up, and people who were incompetent but happened to be the right colour took over, and the money was stolen. There's no question that the ANC has enriched itself. And it's not surprising. Zuma, when he was challenged over the fact that he had used the money of South Africa as a whole to build an estate for himself, he said, well, I'm a Zulu chief. That's what Zulu chiefs do. I mean, that's not a new idea, is it? When the Jews said they wanted a king, God said, well, yeah, if you have a king, they will take the best land, the best cattle, and the most beautiful women. And they did, of course. That's what happens with that kind of hierarchy. That's what's happened in South Africa. So in 1990, South Africa had one of the best electricity delivery systems in the world, and they sold electricity to the countries to the north of them. Now they have regular brownouts because the control of generation was handed over to people who were not competent and didn't have the cultural background to run it. What Frank Zano did in a recent interview is something that I'd come across, but he did it so beautifully. He explained the problem to another African who, it was a friendly conversation. He said, tell me, in your tribal language, how do you translate the word maintenance? The guy said, we don't have that word. And Frank Zano goes on to say, as far as I can see, all the tribal languages of Africa don't have a word for maintenance. They don't think that way. So the word doesn't exist. Now, when I first went to Africa, that was one of the first learning experiences I had that there was no culture of maintenance. Whereas where I grew up, things were maintained regularly. But you can see it's falling apart for us too now. The pothole problem and the like, this is a failure of maintenance. It's predictable what's going to happen, but we're not doing the job we used to do because we're not the same culture anymore. But if your culture doesn't even have a word for maintenance, you have a major problem because you need that word if it's going to work. And that word you can't just insert the word has to come because it's a habit that everyone can see. Now, I can illustrate the problem rather amusingly. We were traveling in a truck along a road which you could sometimes reach 20 kilometres an hour, basically a pothole track. It had been a road in colonial times, but that had passed. And we had a puncture. And the guys got out and took the wheel off and got the tyre off. They could do all those things with various bits of tools, and it already had an inner tube. They pulled it out, and of course it was punctured. And I said, "Don't you have a puncture repair outfit?" "Oh, no, you don't need that." And they got a bit of wire, and they scrunched the inner tube up where the hole was, and then bound it tightly with a bit of wire, and put it all back together again. I said, "That's not going to last long." Said, "Oh, it'll do 50 miles, and you couldn't walk 50 miles in the time, could you? And we'll do it again till we get to somewhere where we can find a new inner tube." That everybody accepted that, but how inefficient that society is by definition, and it goes along the way. You live in the present very much. And the fact that there are things being done in very inefficient ways immediately strikes people coming from other cultures where they're done more efficiently. Another example of how the culture works. Nice Americans saw women who pounded grain for several hours with a stick in a pot. And they could do it in pairs and chat away. It was a social activity. But they spent hours preparing the corn for cornmeal porridge. And American women, that's ridiculous. And the more erudite ones said, "We'll bring some money with us next time and we'll buy a mill in Bujumbura, a small one." Some people actually brought one, but they actually had it carried from America, which wasn't a smart idea. Those mills never lasted more than 2 or 3 years at the most, because the idea of maintenance was not there, even though they were told, "You must clean it up, you must oil it regularly." And they said, yes, but it didn't mean anything to them. It wasn't done. And shortly they were back to pounding them in the wooden pot again. And at the same time saying, why aren't we developing? And for me, that ultimately led to the realization that development needs a cultural base which is authoritative for everyone. Banking, you see, is essential to development. Banking procedures and access to credit and the like is absolutely essential if you're going to have any reliable development with maintenance. But they don't trust anyone in that kind of way. It's not part of their culture. I mean, one of the first things they buy when the West arrives some of the areas we knew were very, very remote. But it's amazing how quickly huts have locks on them. Why? And yet at the same time, during the day, there's a little bit of culture which works much better. During the day, of course, a hut is open or when the people are around. And on one occasion, my one of my daughters had her camera stolen. Jonathan, the youngest, had a lot of African friends, and he said to them, "How do we find out who stole it?" Oh, they said, "Oh, we'll find it," because they could walk into any hut. Nobody cared about that. So looking for Jimmy or whatever, they found the camera and it came back. How culture changes over time is very much related to language. The culture first, the language second, the experiences. Mount Sinai and the experience thereof gave them the law. The telling of the story enculturated the law in a way that made Judaism. And now, cultural Jews, who don't necessarily believe, are intellectually one of the most powerful groups in the world. I don't know how many Jews there are in the world, but it's not a lot. It's somewhere under 50 million, probably under 20 million. And they take a significant proportion of the hard Nobel Prizes every year. The Muslims haven't won a hard Nobel Prize for years. Cultures are different. Intelligence, that's the same. But its development in cultural terms, that's very different indeed. And it clearly isn't related to race. So what should we be doing? I mean, taking the Bible out of school was intellectually indefensible and politically ridiculous, because now we no longer agree to any moral absolutes. That's Lewis's big argument in the Abolition of Man. There are things that were not known to all thoughtful men in all cultures over time. Though there were variants, but they acknowledged a moral authority. And that authority gave them the capacity to answer the big questions in a way that everybody understood. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? How do I respond to death, sickness, and injustice? What can I know? So what ought I to believe? And what ought I to do? Those 9 questions. Now, there were obviously local variations, but they were known and accepted as questions. And good people were judged by the fact that the normative story for the culture was obeyed by them. Now we think teaching ethics as an abstract activity produces ethicists. No, it produces people who know the story of how people have answered these questions, but it doesn't make them ethical. As one of the key figures in starting an ethics program in a medical school where I was teaching, was known to have said to his colleagues in the Department of Philosophy, "I only teach ethics, I don't practice them." And you listening to me, if you take out a piece of paper now and write down the list of people in your life whom you truly trust, you will see that it doesn't bear any obvious relationship to level of education. You can think about that a long while. And for those of you going off to university, into the dangers of rampant moral relativism, which cannot support a society in the long run, except by violence, is what you're going to get without it even being defended. That's the worst part. That's a terrible thing to happen. So, one of the most important things you can do when you go to university, find a little group of people whom you truly trust in your own community, especially the church, and ask them to call you once a week to pray for you, and at least one of them to call you every week and say, "How are you doing? Have you managed to read a Bible this week? Have you managed to pray?" And if the answer is no in both cases, "Have you just lied to me?" is the third question, to give them an escape, because then you can pray with them and for them over the phone. It can keep them going. It kept me going, but not I didn't set it up that way. The good Lord did it for me. But early on in my career as a young doctor, a lovely couple, she was in hospital. I had made a comment about her Bible by the bed because in conversation, I said, I don't have time to go to church anymore, but I grew up in a very Bible-believing environment. And she probed a little bit. And thereafter, when she went out of hospital, she would get her husband every now and again to call me and say, can you get off for a couple of hours and come and have dinner with us? And he would pass the hospital gates on the way home to Wimbledon from the city. And he'd pick me up and they'd take me to their home for a meal where they never questioned me in any aggressive sort of way. They simply loved me. That kept me from losing my way for a couple of years. Then I moved to other places and the decay set in again because I hadn't been adequately prepared for the university, which is not a university anymore because uni, one was the recognition that there is a single source of real truth at the basis of all learning. But we don't accept that now. So they ought to be honest and call it the multiversity of X or Y. And the departments don't agree. I'll never forget the time that our Faculty of Education sent a missive round saying that I should be teaching from a morally neutral position. It wasn't just to me, it was to everybody. Leave your morals behind. I had a student who came to Augustine send me an email later at a well-known university, one of the well-known universities in the United States, which I had thought of as being rather conservative with a small c. And he said, I was told to leave my ethics in the parking lot when it came to things like abortion. There's no respect for rights of conscience anymore. And yet it was those rights of conscience were fundamental to the people who actually gave us the universities, the hospitals, the whole system of caring for the sick and the disadvantaged. Now it's taken over by a liberal elite who don't actually care. They don't care enough to ask, can I rationally put this together in the way that I know it should? Because you can't rationally, if you start with Darwin, end up with ethics. Darwinism is amoral. And the only rule of behavior is, does this action lead to advantage for my genes or not? If the answer is yes, you do it. And if the answer is no, you don't. Read David Stove's Darwinian fairy tales. If you think that I'm overstating the case, I'm not. The book group that we started with the Abolition of Man last Saturday morning, the next book I want them to read is, or to start reading, would be Wendell Berry's Life is a Miracle, which the first chapter starts with a discussion of King Lear, which Wendell Berry says he reads every year. And of course, it's all about what it really means to value someone's life. And has one of the characters in the play who was blinded for his loyalty to the king is persuaded by his son in a very interesting way not to commit suicide. And the old Duke says, I stumbled when I saw, but he didn't see properly until he was blind, what mattered most. But of course, reading Shakespeare now is hard work because it has a Judeo-Christian background. There are multiple references to scriptures throughout Shakespeare's plays. They were given. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why ordinary people could go to the Globe Theatre in the stench of the local abattoirs and the like, and they could understand those lectures, those plays. They had no education But they got the jokes, they got the biblical allusions, because everybody was supposed to go to church. And in Britain, until, well, the 1960s, every child going to school under the public system would hear the Bible read every day for the years they were in school. You don't need to say anything about it even. The fact that there was read gave them a narrative of meaning and a narrative for the settling of disputes, which in the working class carried on for a lot longer than it did elsewhere. I mean, the people who got educated couldn't see afterwards in moral terms. Now we live in a metaphysical desert. One of the phrases in The Abolition of Man is, Lewis could see what was coming. He said, our future problem is not cutting down jungles, but irrigating deserts. And that's true. And the desert, those 9 questions I've already mentioned, and the Bible are unknown, and yet they were the means of understanding. I don't know sometimes how to pick up the conversation, so one has to listen and wait, because the sorts of things that come out in lectures on ethics are horrifying. So you need narrative, but there's no common narrative available to us now. The need for it is apparent. I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? Probably in North America, the one song that could get the most people able to sing along, at least part of it, is probably Amazing Grace. Other pop songs come and go. Some of them last longer than others, but we don't have that narrative of meaning. And it's interesting that the prom concerts in London have started having at least one concert where they sing great hymns and songs that have meaning. Where does your meaning come from? I mean, that's what Jordan Peterson started work on, and he's been incredibly successful. Millions of people listen to him because he struggles publicly with the need for meaning and how you achieve it and what we need to do to keep it in place. And what he's done, of course, is stumble upon the importance of the hierarchy of goods. I mean, philosophical goods, truth-telling, saving lives, paying your taxes, whatever. There's whole ranges of things we all know we ought to do. But they're not laid out as a smorgasbord where you take what you want and leave the rest. They're hierarchical. And the commonest error in our society is to get the hierarchy wrong. The liberal elite put multiculturalism at the top. So they defend the rights of Muslims to express their religion as they wish, without realizing that if they really express it as they wish, they will ultimately destroy Christianity. And as for, if you think you can, homosexuals for Gaza, they'd throw you off the top of the news building that's still standing. The hierarchy of goods has to be thought about. Christianity was destroyed in the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, by the Muslims. They said they accepted the people of the book, but only if they paid, 3 times as much taxes as a Muslim did. And the tax was so high that they had to put every 4th child was given to the government to turn them into the most vicious fighters that the Muslims had to hand, ending up killing Christians. ISIS is only doing what the Quran said they should do. Perhaps somewhat excessive, but certainly justifiable. If the Quran is to be the great book, all societies have a great book. If the great book is the book of nature, you have an animistic pagan society which is fatalistic. If it's the Quran and the Hadith, you get Islam. If it's the Old Testament, Jews. If the New, Christians. If the Veda Vedanta, you get Islam, and so on. Great books form great societies. Now we're thoroughly illiterate, we can expect our society to fall apart because the means to hold it together is disappearing. Justice is disappearing. And you see people, what's happening over the gross, what should I say, redirection of state funds from Minnesota to Somalia. Urshi Hali has said, well, that's what you would expect. Everything in Somalia is done on a tribal basis. So loyalty to the tribe is the way you survive. So the fact that, $1 million a week or a month or whatever it is has been diverted from government activities in Minnesota to non-governmental activities in Somalia, that to them is perfectly reasonable. I'm looking after my society. That's not compatible with the kind of government and the kind of world we had, because we do need objective moral truth. If there is no foundation to stand on, where do you go? The best example, I've quoted it many times, and I'll go on doing it because it still needs to be said, because it's not widely known, and every lawyer should be forced to read it aloud, in my view, at graduation or some stage. And it's Arthur Leff's account of the problem that faces us with justice in the modern world. Modern world was 1979 in the Duke Law Review. Leff on justice will find it. It goes, paraphrasing, roughly like this. He says, I want to believe, and so do you, in a complete immanent, that means accessible to us, not imminent, but immanent. The exam next week is both imminent, it has to be known, immanent. What is known to us? There has to be something that's known to us. A system of law that is both immanent and transcendence, from beyond us. Because everybody has to bend the knee to the same law. So where did it come from? That's the big question. Findable rules that direct us as to how to live our lives righteously, because we all actually want to do that. The good that I would, I do not. Evil that I would not, that I do. We all want to do it, or we all don't. That's the human condition. And he says, but I also want to believe, and so do you, in no such thing, but rather that we are wholly free to decide for ourselves what we ought to do and what we ought to be. What we want, heaven help us, is to be simultaneously perfectly ruled and perfectly free. That is at the same time to discover the right and the good and to invent it. Can't have both. And the trouble is apparent. Laws are written not with the intent of justice, but with the intent of particular ends for particular groups. That does not a nation build. So, go away, write that list of people you trust, and start asking them and yourself, why? And then go on to think about what we're going to do about this. Read Wendell Berry's Life is a Miracle. It will challenge you. And that, I think, is probably time for me to stop. Stop coming if you want me to stop. I'm getting old. I wouldn't mind stopping, but I really do enjoy the fact that people write to me and encourage me to continue. So, the Lord be with you.